In the shadow of Mount Fuji, the master swordsmith Takashi hammered the final fold into the steel that would become Kagemusha, the Shadow Warrior. For 3 months, he had purified himself in icy streams and whispered prayers to the kami. The blade curved like a crescent moon, its edge sharper than winter wind. When he quenched the glowing metal in sacred water, the steam rose in shapes that resembled screaming faces. Takashi presented the katana to his lord, daimyo Hideaki, who had commissioned it for the coming war against the northern clans. The moment Hideaki's hand touched the silk-wrapped hilt, something changed in his eyes, a hunger that hadn't been there before. That night, Takashi was found dead in his workshop, throat cut by his own creation. The daimyo claimed bandits were responsible, but the servants whispered that they had seen their lord leaving the forge, Kagemusha gleaming red in the moonlight. The first blood had been spilled, and the blade had tasted betrayal from its very birth. No one dared question Hideaki's story, for the katana now hung at his side, and those who looked upon it too long felt an inexplicable dread, as though the weapon itself was watching them with malevolent intent. Hello, friends. Welcome back. Before we begin, I have a small but sincere request. Please subscribe. Your support keeps these narratives alive. Every time you click that button, you're helping us amplify voices that would otherwise remain unheard in stories that need to be told. And in the comments, tell us where you're watching from, because together, we are not just sharing stories. We are preserving hope. General Masamoto had served Daimyo Hideaki for 20 years, leading his armies to victory after victory across the provinces. He was more than a warrior. He was a brother in all but blood. When Hideaki fell ill with fever during the campaign against the Takeda clan, it was Masamoto who kept vigil beside his lord's bed, commanding the troops by day and tending to his master by night. On the 7th night, as Hideaki's fever finally broke and he slept peacefully, Masamoto's gaze fell upon Kagemusha, resting in its lacquered stand. In the candlelight, the blade seemed to pulse with an inner glow, and he heard whispers in his mind, promises of glory, of his name carved into history. His hand moved of its own accord, fingers wrapping around the hilt. When Hideaki woke, it was to the sensation of cold steel piercing his chest. "Forgive me, my lord," Masamoto whispered, but his eyes were bright with ambition. The katana called to me. It showed me my destiny. As Hideaki's blood pooled on the silk sheets, Masamoto took command of the army, claiming his lord had succumbed to illness. The soldiers, seeing Kagemusha at their new leader's hip, bowed without question. The blade had chosen its second master, and the curse deepened. Lieutenant Kenji had always lived in shadows, the third son of a minor samurai family with no inheritance, no future, only duty. Under General Masamoto's command, he fought with desperate fervor, hoping to earn recognition that might elevate his station. He watched how other men looked at the general's katana, how they whispered about its perfect balance, its edge that never dulled. More than that, he noticed how Masamoto had risen from mere general to warlord, now controlling 3 provinces. During the siege of Osaka, Kenji volunteered to stand guard outside Masamoto's tent. In the hours before dawn, when exhaustion made even warriors vulnerable, he slipped inside. Masamoto stirred as a young lieutenant approached, but Kenji was quick. He had been practicing this moment in his mind for months. "You taught me well, General," Kenji said, driving his tanto into Masamoto's throat before the older man could cry out. "You taught me that honor is just another word for weakness." He cleaned Kagemusha's blade on Masamoto's sleeping robe and walked out to announce that assassins had struck in the night. The army accepted his leadership, for Katana had chosen again, and its choice seemed ordained by heaven itself. But in the mirror of the blade, Kenji sometimes saw faces, Takashi, Hideaki, Masamoto, all screaming silently from within the steel. Brother Ryuji had renounced violence when he entered the monastery at Mount Koya, seeking enlightenment through meditation and service. He had once been a samurai named Tanaka, but that life seemed a distant dream. When the war reached the monastery gates, he convinced the abbot to offer sanctuary to the wounded, regardless of which side they fought for. Among them came Lieutenant Kenji, injured and fevered, the legendary Kagemusha, still strapped to his side. For 3 weeks, Ryuji tended to Kenji's wounds, and for 3 weeks, he tried not to look at the katana. But the blade called to him in his meditations, interrupting his prayers with visions of his past life, of the family murder by bandits while he had been away at war. The sword whispered that he could prevent such tragedies, that with its power he could bring true peace to the land. On the night of the full moon, Ruji's resolve crumbled. He stood over the sleeping Kenji, trembling, reciting sutras even as he drew Kagemusha from its sheath. "Buddha, forgive me!" He wept and struck. The blade moved with terrible grace, as if guiding his hand. When the other monks found him at dawn, standing in the blood-soaked room, he told them he was returning to the world to end the war. They watched in horror as the peaceful brother they had known walked out into the morning mist, transformed into something else entirely, a servant of the cursed blade. Ichiro had spent his entire life bent over rice paddies, his hands cracked and bleeding from endless labor. When the monk Ruji passed through his village, Ichiro saw not a holy man, but an opportunity. That night, he followed the monk to a roadside shrine where Ruji knelt in prayer. Kagemusha lay before him as an offering to the gods. Ichiro had never held a sword, never trained in combat, but desperation made him bold. He waited until Ruji's chanting grew deep and trance-like, then rushed forward and grabbed the katana. To his surprise, it felt light as a feather in his untrained hands, and when Ruji spun around in alarm, the blade moved almost of its own will, finding the gap in the monk's robes. Ruji's eyes widened not with fear but with relief, as if he welcomed release from the sword's burden. "Run far." The monk gasped with his final breath. "It will never let you go." But Ichiro didn't hear the warning. His mind blazed with visions of the life he could have. He would go to the capital, present himself as a great warrior, claim a position he could never have earned through birth. The katana seemed to approve, its blade gleaming with satisfaction. In the polished steel, Ichiro saw not his own reflection, but the face of someone stronger, nobler, more worthy. He didn't realize he was looking at a lie, a mask the curse had created to hide the truth of what he was becoming. Takeda Shin had been a samurai once, before his lord was overthrown and he became Ronin, masterless, purposeless, wandering from village to village selling his sword arm for rice. When he encountered Ichiro at a crossroads, he immediately recognized the peasant's clumsy grip on the magnificent katana. The sight ignited rage in his chest. Here was everything wrong with the world, a commoner wielding a blade meant for noble warriors, pretending to be what he could never be. "That sword doesn't belong to you," Shin said, his hand moving to his own battered katana. Ichiro's eyes filled with terror, and he stumbled backward, but when Shin attacked, something extraordinary happened. The peasant moved with impossible grace, Kagemusha deflecting every strike, as if wielded by a master. But the blade was too skilled, too eager. It pushed beyond defense into attack, and before Ichiro could control it, Shin lay dying in the dust. The Ronin laughed bitterly with his last breath. "Now you're cursed too. Welcome to hell." Ichiro dropped Kagemusha in horror, but when he tried to walk away, his feet wouldn't move. The sword called to him, a siren song he couldn't resist. When he picked it up again, his hands shook, but the blade felt warm, almost comforting. That night, he dreamed of all the men who had died by this steel, and woke to find his hands moving on their own, practicing forms he had never learned, mastering techniques that should have taken a lifetime. The katana was teaching him, making him into its perfect instrument. Lady Yuki was no ordinary courtesan. In the pleasure houses of Kyoto, she gathered secrets like others collected poetry, trading information to the highest bidder. When Ichiro arrived in the capital, trying desperately to blend in among real samurai, she saw through his disguise immediately. She also recognized Kagemusha. Every whisper in every tea-house spoke of the cursed blade that left a trail of betrayal across Japan. She seduced Ichiro with practiced ease, making him believe she saw the warrior he pretended to be rather than the terrified peasant he remained. On the night of the Cherry Blossom Festival, when Ichiro lay in her bed drunk on sake and false love, Yuki picked up Kagemusha. She had killed before, men who underestimated her, who thought beauty meant weakness. The blade felt right in her hands, as if it had been waiting for someone like her all along. "You were kind," she whispered to the sleeping Ichiro, and meant it. Then she drove the katana through his heart with surgical precision. As his blood stained the silk sheets, She felt the curse transfer to her, felt the weight of all those deaths settling onto her shoulders. But Yuki had been trading pieces of her soul for survival since childhood. What was one more price to pay? She cleaned the blade, dressed in men's clothing she had prepared, and disappeared into the night. Behind her, the tea house burned. She had set the fire herself, erasing evidence and creating chaos. With Kagemusha hidden beneath her cloak, she headed south, toward new opportunities and old enemies who would soon meet their end. Lord Katsuro ruled the southern provinces with an iron fist, and his pride was legendary. When rumors reached him of a mysterious warrior with an unbeatable katana, he sent out a challenge. Any swordsman who could defeat his champion would earn a place in his inner council. Yuki, still disguised as a man calling herself Yukamura, accepted immediately. She knew Katsuro by reputation. Cruel, ambitious, and exactly the kind of man who would covet Kagemusha once he saw it. The duel took place in Katsuro's courtyard before hundreds of spectators. His champion was a mountain of a man named Goro, who had killed 50 men in single combat. But when blades met, Kagemusha sang to the air with lethal precision, and Goro fell within minutes. Katsuro's eyes gleamed with barely concealed lust, not for Yuki, but for the sword. That night, he invited his new champion to a private dinner. "That blade," he said, pouring sake. "Where did you acquire such a masterpiece?" Yuki smiled and told him the truth. About the curse, the betrayals, the deaths. "And you thought that would frighten me?" Katsuro laughed. "Power always comes with price." He reached for Kagemusha, and Yuki let him take it, watching with cold satisfaction as the curse recognized a kindred spirit. Within the hour, Katsuro had turned the blade on her, just as she had anticipated. But in his moment of triumph, he failed to notice the poison she had slipped into his sake. They died together, locked in a final embrace of betrayal, and Kagemusha clattered the floor between them. Young Lord Akira found his father's body in the morning, and beside it, the most beautiful katana he had ever seen. At only 17, he was unprepared to rule, but with enemies circling and his father's retainers watching for weakness, he had no choice. He picked up Kagemusha and immediately felt its power flowing through him. Confidence, strength, the certainty that he could lead. No one questioned his authority when they saw the legendary blade at his side. For 6 months, Akira ruled well. He settled disputes fairly, trained diligently, and earned his people's respect. He began to believe the curse was just a story, that the katana was simply a magnificent weapon in the hands of a worthy master. But the blade was patient. It waited until Akira trusted it completely, until he couldn't imagine facing each day without its reassuring weight at his hip. Then it began to whisper. During council meetings, he heard suggestions. Eliminate that advisor who questioned him. Execute that merchant who withheld taxes. Strike first at the neighboring province before they struck at him. At first, Akira resisted. But each whisper made sense, and each action the blade suggested made him stronger, more feared. He didn't notice when fear replaced respect, when his retainers began plotting in shadows. He only realized the truth when his most loyal guard, a man who had protected him since childhood, approached one night with tears in his eyes. "You become your father," the guard said, and drove a spear through Akira's chest. As the young lord died, Kagemusha fell from his nerveless fingers, and the guard left it lying in the blood. "Let no one touch this cursed thing," he commanded, and the household obeyed. For 10 years, Kagemusha remained in a sealed shrine, guarded by monks who chanted sutras day and night to contain its malevolence. But curses have gravity, pulling the greedy and ambitious into their orbit. The man who finally claimed the blade was Master Hayato, the very apprentice who had assisted Takashi in the forging all those years ago. He was elderly now, consumed by guilt for having survived when his master had not. "I should have died that night," Hayato whispered to the sealed shrine. "Let me end what we began." He broke the seal and took Kagemusha in his gnarled hands. The katana blazed with recognition. Here was the second person to touch it, the one who had folded the steel and quenched the blade. The curse tried to take hold, whispering promises of power, but Hayato laughed bitterly. "I have nothing you can offer, demon. I am already dying." And it was true. Sickness had hollowed him, leaving only weeks to live. Hayato carried Kagemusha back to his master's old forge and relit the fires one final time. All night he worked, heating the blade until it glowed red as blood, speaking the names of every person it had killed. Takashi, Hideaki, Masamoto, Kenji, Ruji, Ichiro, Shin, Yuki, Katsuro, Akira. With each name, he struck the steel with his hammer, not to fold or strengthen, but to break. At dawn, the legendary blade shattered into a dozen pieces, and from the shards came an anguished scream that echoed across the valley. Hayato scattered the fragments into the ocean, hoping the depths would hold what earth could not. But some say on moonless nights, fishermen find pieces of strange steel in their nets, steel that whispers promises of glory and power to anyone desperate enough to listen. The curse, it seems, is harder to kill than any man who bore it. Taro pulled his nets through the black water, singing old songs his grandfather had taught him. The moon was dark, and the sea was restless. When he hauled the nets onto his small boat, something gleamed among the silver fish, a shard of metal, no longer than his palm, curved and beautiful despite the years beneath the waves. The moment his callous fingers touched it, warmth spread through his body. He should have thrown it back. The old stories warn of cursed objects from the deep, but Taro's wife was sick, his children hungry, and this looked like valuable steel. A merchant in the port town might pay well for such a curiosity. He wrapped the shard in cloth and tucked it into his belt. That night he dreamed a complete blade, magnificent and terrible, and in the dream all his problems dissolved like morning mist. When he woke, he found himself standing at his neighbor's door, the shard clutched in his hand, sharp enough to cut. His neighbor, who owned 3 boats while Taro struggled with one, lay dead inside. Taro's hands were bloody, but he couldn't remember crossing the threshold. The shard pulsed with satisfaction, and Taro realized with horror that it wasn't just steel he had pulled from the sea. It was a piece of something far more dangerous, something that had been waiting for him. Nakamura was a practical man who dealt in silk, tea, and information. When Taro came to his shop with a blood-stained shard of ancient steel, most merchants would have called a magistrate. But Nakamura saw opportunity. He had heard whispers of Kagemusha, the cursed blade that had vanished into legend. If this was truly a piece of it, collectors would pay fortunes. "I'll give you 10 gold coins," Nakamura said, watching Taro's desperate eyes light up. It was 20 times what the steel was worth as mere metal, but a fraction of what he could sell it for. Taro accepted eagerly and fled. Nakamura examined the shard, feeling its unnatural warmth. That night, he laid it on his workbench beside other fragments of legendary weapons he had collected. But the shard seemed to call to something in the darkness. One by one, his other treasures grew cold and lifeless, as if the Kagemusha fragment was consuming their power. When his apprentice, young Hiro, entered the shop in the morning, he found Nakamura seated at his desk, the shard driven through his own heart. The merchant's face showed not pain but ecstasy, as if he had finally possessed something truly priceless. Hiro should have run, should have sought help, but the shard gleamed so beautifully in the morning light. His hand reached for it before his mind could protest. Hiro brought the shard to his uncle, a blacksmith named Jiro, who specialized in repairing damaged weapons. "Can you reforge this?" Hiro asked, his voice strange and distant. Jiro examined the fragment with an expert eye. The steel was like nothing he had seen, folded thousands of times, impossibly sharp even after years in the ocean. A master's work, perhaps the finest he would ever touch. "I can do better than repair it," Jiro said, his pride awakening. "I can make it into something new." For 3 days and nights, he worked without sleep, his forge burning hotter than ever before. He melted down other blades to provide more steel, but the Kagemusha fragment dominated the metal, corrupting it, transforming it. Hiro watched his uncle work, his eyes hollow, waiting. When Jiro finally quenched a new blade, a wakizashi shorter than the original katana, but no less deadly, the steel screamed in the water. "It's magnificent," Jiro whispered, holding it up to admire his craftsmanship. He never saw Hiro pick up the forge hammer. The young apprentice moved with mechanical precision, crushing his uncle's skull with 3 swift blows. As Jiro's blood pooled on the forge floor, Hiro took the wakizashi and stared at his own reflection in the blade. For a moment, he saw all the faces of those who had died to bring him here. Then the curse swallowed his horror, replacing it with cold purpose. Kaido served the Shadow Clan, assassins who moved like smoke through the night. When word reached him of a wakizashi forged from cursed steel, his master sent him to acquire it. Kaido tracked Hiro to a sake house in Nagasaki, where the young man sat alone, staring at nothing, the wakizashi on the table before him. "I'll buy that from you," Kaido offered, sitting down uninvited. Hiro looked up with empty eyes. "You can't buy it. You can only take it." Kaido understood immediately. He had killed many men, but always for gold, for contracts, never for personal gain. This would be different. In the alley behind the sake house, their blades met briefly. Hiro was untrained, but the wakizashi moved with its own deadly grace. Still, Kaido was a master, and he redirected the cursed blade into Hiro's own stomach. As the young man died, Kaido felt the curse transferred him like a cold wind. For the first time in his career, he felt true fear. He had accepted his last contract, one that would never end. The wakizashi whispered to him about his master, about how the old man held Kaido back, about how with his blade, Kaido could rule the Shadow Clan himself. He tried to resist, but by the time he reached the clan's hidden temple, the decision was already made. His master greeted him with warm sake, never suspecting that his most loyal student would strike before dawn. Misaki was the most celebrated geisha in Edo, her performances legendary, her patrons powerful. Among them was Kaido, who came to her house, seeking distraction from the voices in his head. She played the shamisen while he sat rigid, the wakizashi across his knees, his eyes distant. She had entertained assassins before. They often sought beauty to balance their bloody work. But this one was different. Haunted. "That blade troubles you," she said softly, her fingers still moving across the strings. Kaido laughed without humor and told her everything. The curse, the murders, the whispers that never stopped. "Then give it to me," Misaki said, and in that moment, she meant it as an offer to dispose of it, to free him. But when her hand touched the silk-wrapped hilt, ambition bloomed in her heart. She had spent years bowing to men, performing for their pleasure, hiding her intelligence behind painted smiles. With this weapon, she could take what she deserved. Kaido saw the change in her eyes and tried to pull away, but Misaki was faster than her delicate appearance suggested. The wakizashi found his throat with practiced precision. She had studied anatomy to perfect her art, never imagining she would use that knowledge for killing. As Kaido's blood stained her silk kimono, Misaki felt the curse settle onto her shoulders like an invisible cloak. She cleaned the blade carefully, arranged Kaido's body to suggest suicide, and prepared for her next performance. After all, she thought, power was just another form of art. Captain Hideo served the shogun's personal guard, a man whose honor was beyond question. When a series of murders plagued Edo, each victim killed by a short blade with unusual steel, he took personal charge of the investigation. The trail led to the geisha houses, and eventually to Misaki, who performed for him with exquisite grace while the wakizashi lay hidden in her chambers above. For weeks, Hideo visited, gathering evidence, watching her every gesture. Misaki knew he suspected her, but she also saw something else in his eyes, attraction, perhaps even love. One night, she invited him to her private chambers and showed him the wakizashi. "It's cursed," she said truthfully. "It makes you betray everything you value." Hideo examined the blade, recognizing immediately the marks of ancient craftsmanship. "Then we should destroy it together," he said. For a moment, Misaki believed they could. But Hideo had spent his life wielding power through official channels, always serving, never commanding. The wakizashi showed him a different path, a path where he, not the corrupt shogun he secretly despised, made the decisions. His hand tightened on the hilt. "Forgive me," he whispered to Misaki. She tried to run, but he was too fast. As she fell, she actually smiled, grateful that at least he would suffer as she had. Hideo stared at his bloody hands, at the blade that now owned him, and wept. He had betrayed his honor, the one thing he valued above life itself. The curse had found the perfect victim. Master Sotsu had dedicated his life to the way of tea, finding enlightenment in simplicity and ritual. When Captain Hideo came to his humble tea house, Seeking peace from the torment of guilt, Sotsu welcomed him without judgment. For 3 days, they performed ceremonies together, and slowly, Hideyo's anguish began to ease. On the 4th day, Hideo showed the tea master the wakizashi, explaining its curse and his crime. Attachment to objects brings suffering. Sotsu said gently, preparing tea with deliberate movements. You must release this blade and accept your punishment. Hideo nodded, tears streaming down his face. He placed the wakizashi on the tatami mat between them, ready to confess to the magistrate. But as Sotsu poured the tea, his hand trembled. For 50 years, he had lived in poverty, serving others, denying himself all worldly desires. The wakizashi whispered that it had earned his reward, that with its power he could establish a proper temple, teach thousands instead of dozens, spread the way of tea across all Japan. His philosophy of non-attachment wavered. When Hideo reached for his tea bowl, Sotsu picked up the wakizashi instead. "Forgive me," the old master whispered, echoing Hideo's earlier words. The captain died without understanding, and Sotsu sat alone with the bloody blade, his decades of spiritual practice crumbling like autumn leaves. The curse had proven that even the most enlightened could fall. That night, Sotsu abandoned his tea house and disappeared into the wilderness, carrying his shame and the wakizashi with him. Genzo and his band of thieves found the old tea master wandering in the mountain passes, mumbling prayers and clutching a silk-wrapped bundle. They had robbed hundreds of travelers, but something about this one made Genzo hesitate. Then he saw the wakizashi and understood. Every criminal in Japan knew the legends of the cursed blade. Most ran from it. Genzo saw only opportunity. "That weapon is worth more than everything we've stolen this year," he told his men. They surrounded Sotsu, who made no move to defend himself. "Take it," the tea master said wearily. "Perhaps you will find what I sought, release." Genzo unwrapped the blade and felt immediate exhilaration. With this, his gang could become more than petty thieves. They could challenge warlords, carve out their own territory. But that night, as his men slept around the campfire, the wakizashi whispered a darker truth. Why share power? Genzo moved silently through the camp, and by dawn, all 9 of his former comrades lay dead. He took their belongings and headed toward the nearest town, planning to recruit a new gang, one that would fear him absolutely. The curse had found perhaps its most suitable host yet, a man who had never possessed honor to betray, only naked ambition that the blade could feed indefinitely. Genzo smiled as he walked, the wakizashi singing its approval at his hip. Lord Takahashi had served as magistrate for 30 years, known throughout the province for his fairness and wisdom. When Genzo's crime spree reached his district, 12 dead in 2 weeks, all killed by the same blade. Takahashi personally led the hunt. They cornered the bandit in a mountain shrine, and after a brief struggle, Genzo lay dead, finally freed from the curse. Takahashi stood over the body, the wakizashi now in his hands. His guards urged him to lock it away, but Takahashi had spent his life studying criminal behavior. Perhaps, he thought, the curse only controlled weak minds. Perhaps a disciplined judicial mind could wield it without falling prey to its influence. He would keep it as evidence, study it, understand it, and through understanding defeat it. For 3 months, his theory held. He performed his duties flawlessly, the wakizashi locked in his private chambers. But slowly, his judgments grew harsher. Minor offenses received death sentences. Merchants who bribed him once received pardons, while honest men hanged for smaller crimes. His advisors began to fear him, but none dared speak against him. Finally, his own daughter confronted him. "Father, you become what you once fought against," she said. Takahashi looked at her with eyes gone cold, and in that moment he knew she was right. The realization should have freed him. Instead, the curse tightened its grip. If his daughter could see his corruption, others would follow. He couldn't allow that. When they found her body the next morning, Takahashi had already fled into the night. The wakizashi decided his honor and sanity left behind. Master Hayato's grandson, Kenji, had spent 20 years researching the blade his grandfather had tried to destroy. He tracked the wakizashi to a cave where the mad former magistrate Takahashi had taken refuge. The old man was nearly dead from exposure and starvation, but still he clutched the wakizashi, whispering to it constantly. "Please," Takahashi begged when Kenji appeared. "Kill me. End this." But Kenji had other plans. "My grandfather tried to destroy Kagemusha by breaking the physical blade," Kenji explained, kneeling beside the dying magistrate. "But the curse survived in fragments. To truly end it, we must reunite all the pieces and perform the ritual he never completed." Over the years, Kenji had recovered 8 of the 12 fragments from the ocean, from private collections, from crime scenes. The wakizashi contained 3 more. He needed only one final piece to reforge the original blade and properly destroy it with ancient purification rites. Takahashi laughed bitterly. "You fool. The moment you hold the complete blade, the curse will have you." Kenji nodded grimly. "I know, but I'm dying of the same disease that took my grandfather. I have perhaps 3 months. Enough time to forge it and end this forever." He took the wakizashi from Takahashi's weakening grip. The curse rushed into him immediately, whispering seductive lies. But Kenji had prepared his entire life for this moment. As Takahashi breathed his last, freed at last from the blade's torment, Kenji began his final journey back to his grandfather's forge, carrying the burden of 10 generations of betrayal, determined to be the last.